navigation is there's two kinds of errors, and this is true not just of sailing navigation, but of aviation. The worst kind of error is a blunder, and this is where you transpose the digits when you're putting in a waypoint, or you overlook a mark, or you start early, or you start late, or you don't read the sailing instructions. And these blunders, it's really important to avoid blunders. And the best way to avoid blunders is with checklists and with memorization. Then there's the other kind of mistakes, which are just judgment calls. You know, you have a situation where there's two weather models, they disagree, and you pick one based on your best judgment, and you're wrong. Well, those things happen. But you got to think about the errors differently. And so when the 747 strays over the old Soviet Union, probably a blunder, you know, where they transpose digits. But where people, you know, you call a ley line wrong, that's not a blunder, that's just a small error. So you think about them differently, and the way you avoid errors is different for the two kinds. The Navigator, for the most part, you're going to get the blame for all blunders on the boat, so you might as well take responsibility to avoid them, because you will get the blame. So you got to be sure you don't start early, don't start late, don't miss a mark, don't run aground, don't misinterpret the SIs of the notice of race, don't be caught without having the necessary equipment, the OSRs. Be prepared with the right procedural approach to protests, have your measurement certificate on board signed. Any of those things go wrong, and it's the navigator's mistake. The electronic safety gear's got to be on boat, it's all got to work. You got to do your check-ins, your start, your roll call, pre-finish check-ins. All the forms have to be filed both before the race and after the race. And you got to memorize stuff. So when you're the navigator and people ask you, you know, what class starts before us, or what's our class number, or exactly what time is our prep signal, or what are the required marks on the way out to sea, it's very poor form to fumble through your papers and look it up. You have to memorize those answers, and then as soon as you've given the answer, you fumble through your papers to make sure you got it right. But you got to memorize that stuff. Stop me for questions, much more fun, I think, for all of us. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about exotic, professional, long-term preparation for the occasional opportunity that I've had to perfectly prepare for a really important race where you've got the time and the money. So this would be the sort of thing you do to prepare for the Volvo Ocean Race, or to prepare for, you know, setting around the world record on Groupama. And I've once had a situation to prepare at this level for a normal race, you know, in Pyewacket. But normally you don't get the opportunity to do stuff this way. So what you do is typically I'll try to get 10 years of weather data for the 2 weeks surrounding the calendar dates of the start. And the weather data you get, and this is important to understand, you're not getting 10 years of weather forecasts, meaning the forecast that was 10 years ago. You go to NOAA and you get the reanalysis files. And NOAA does this. They compute a reanalysis and they put it in GRIB format, and the reanalysis files are what they thought actually happened. So it's a GRIB file, and you can route against it, but it's actually every 12 hours, which are the observations times, it's what NOAA thought the state of the world actually was. So you get those NOAA reanalysis files, and I'll typically do it for 10 years, because prior to 10 years, the weather wasn't nearly as good, because they didn't have the scatterometer satellites running. But about 10 or 12 years ago, they started initializing the weather models with the scatterometer satellites, and the weather got much, much better. So I limit it to about the 10 years, and then I'll get data so I can calculate starts for a week before the calendar start of the race and up to a week after the calendar start of the race. Then what you do is you run 140 routes. So you take your 10 years times your 14 days. So you basically start the race 140 different times, assuming that climatologically the weather's pretty similar for the week before and the week after the calendar start time. Typically I'll use the ORR VPPs, which are really good, thanks to Jim and Dan and their effort, or I'll use the designer VPPs. Some designers are better than others. but use the same source. And then often what you do as part of this process is, part of the project is to help the designer analyze different configurations for the race. So what you'll do is you'll take different boats and you'll race those different boats on that same leg on those 140 starts. And then you analyze the results and you look at the percentage of time in different wind angles, the percentage of different wind speeds. You look at which boat wins, what percentage of the time. You look at why that boat won. And then it's important to sort of tinker around with those results and figure out what happened. And if it's an early part of the process and you haven't selected your boat for the Volvo, you go round and round and round with the designer and you come up with new hypotheses and you check them and you test them and you come up with interesting things like light air performance doesn't matter. That's what we discovered in the Volvo, that you could give away light air performance. And if you were, in exchange for that, if you were a little bit faster reaching in breeze, it dominated it. Plus, intuitively we know things like light air performance isn't actually controlled by the boat very much. Light air performance is normally controlled by hitting the shifts, knowing how the thermals work against the beach, knowing how to play clouds. So in the case of ABN AMRO, we intentionally gave away light air performance to gain medium air reaching, and it paid off. But this is when you figure that stuff out. And you can spend a long time in that process of analyzing the results, coming up with new configurations, and then racing those configurations on those 140 races. And it would take overnight to run 140 races on a boat just using a laptop. On a more powerful computer, you can do it in an hour or so. Then what you do is you got to develop polars for the boat. And you start with, your practice polars and your, the theoretical polars. But it's really important that your navigation polars be polars that you can achieve. So on a boat that I race a lot, like, ABN AMRO and the Volvo or Pyewacket or something, I log all the data when the boat's being raced. And then I develop polar files from that logged data. And you have to do it carefully because you have to weight that data as a function of how much time you've spent. And boats don't actually spend much time scattered around the polar plot. They spend most of their time in certain areas. So you have to do this carefully. But nevertheless, what you want to do is you want to come up with a set of polars that you can achieve. Day in, day out, on average, you can achieve. So you don't go to any trouble when you're logging this data to avoid sail changes and to avoid less good helmsmen and to avoid bad sea states. You just take it all, because the boat's racing and that's representative of the boat's performance. Now this is different than your targets. Your targets are what you use inshore, and that's the goal of the boat speed you should achieve. The navigation polars have to be polars that on average you end up where the router thinks you're going to be. Because if you have navigation polars that are too aggressive and you're not able to be where the router thinks you are, then the route is going to come up with fallacious conclusions. Yes?
Stan, could you repeat that part about when you said scattered amongst the polars? Is that what you're alluding to? You have the wrong sail up or something? So you said it's careful to look at everything scattered across the pole.
Well, I guess what I was saying there is, you start with a new boat, you start with your theoretical polars. You very quickly edit to make them achievable. But then as you start to race the boat more and more, you take the actual log data from races and then you use that data and you force your polars to go through where that aggregate data was. But you have to weight it with the amount of data you have on different points of sail. And I would do this on the Volvo at the end of every leg. So by the time the Volvo is most of the way over, in between legs, I'd go back and I'd take all the data that we've ever sailed ABN AMRO, and then I'd rerun it, and then I'd do yet another adjustment of the polars. And so you get your polars really good, but one mistake some navigators make is to have the polars be aggressive, to have the polars be how you want to sail the boat. And for routing, they can't be. The polars have to be achievable, what on average you're going to achieve. And sometimes you beat them, sometimes you're short, but on average, they got to be what you're going to do. And therefore, they're going to have to include sail changes, reefs, unreefs, all the different helmsmen. They have to be achievable. In the Volvo case, it's also helpful to get polars for your competitors. And sometimes you have to do that by inspection. Well, those guys don't reach as well as we do, so we'll knock them down a little, but in light air they beat better. So you adjust your own polars to reflect your impression of your competitors. But in the Volvo, I was also able to basically get the data out of Virtual Spectator. And so what I did is the Virtual Spectator program, which lets you watch the Volvo race, you wait till after the leg is over, and they switch it into this relatively high resolution mode where I think it was every minute you'd get data points. And then the data is encrypted, so you can't get between the client program and the server because the communication is encrypted. But what you can do is you can write a little robot that operates the client's program, and then you use OCR to take the data off the screen. So what I'd have a robot do is sail each boat all the way around the world, and then do OCR on the screen to measure the true wind angle, the true wind speed, and the boat speed. And I'd build a set of polars for every competitor after every leg. And then just for grins, I'd do it on our own boat and see how it compared to what I knew the polars to be. And it was amazingly good.
So when you say you can do that, you really mean you.
It's, yeah, any IT, any engineer. This is... The other thing that's helpful to do is to navigate previous notable tracks in their weather. And so this was particularly helpful for Groupama. So what I would do is I took all the multi-hull tracks all the way back to, Enza. And then I took all of the Vendée Globe tracks because there were tracks that some interesting mistakes had been made and that Franck, was somewhat familiar with. And then you get the reanalysis weather for those tracks. And then you walk yourself around the world, kind of putting yourself in their position, seeing what they did, looking at the weather that they were looking at, and then making those decisions and then seeing how it played out. And this takes weeks to do this. But then the thing to do is you find the most expensive decisions. And I'll tell you what I mean by expensive. And then you walk the skipper through those. And the expensive decisions are the most interesting thing in navigation. But you'll find a time, typically 5 or 6 times in the way around the world and a couple of times in the Transpac, where you have to give away a ton of distance in order to sail the fastest course to the finish. And that's what I mean by expensive. So you got to ask the skipper, here's what I want to do. I want to give away all these miles. I want to sail from first place into last place in the standings in order to win the leg. And you have to have the confidence of the skipper to do that. And in order to have the confidence of the skipper, he's got to recognize the situation. You've got to have taken the time ahead of time, in a meeting, and say, okay, we're in the situation now going around the South Atlantic High where I told you about, where we got to hit the corner hard. This is going to be expensive. We're going to pull our hair out, but we got to do it. And then the skipper has to remember that. And then if you have anecdotes, remember so-and-so on the Vendée, remember this, the skipper says, oh, yeah. And so then you get the permission to spend those miles. And in the Volvo, it was interesting. The first couple of times we did it, the first leg has 2 of these. Where do you jibe to go south in the South Atlantic? And then the second one is how far do you take that corner in the southwest corner of the South Atlantic High. And the first one, I'm the new guy on the boat, but I've told the whole crew and briefed them completely that we got to sail into last place in order to win this leg. And it worked. But the guys were nervous as hell, but by the end of the Volvo, it was frightening because I'd tell the crew, hey, we got to sail into last place in order to win the leg. And they'd say, yeah, whatever you want. This is the nav station. I put in a few photos. And it's interesting, all the photos of Groupama 3 look like this. They're blurred due to the motion blur because it's a multi-hull. But this is the only nav station that I've operated in where I had a view. This is the escape hatch. My nav station is right here. This is the computer screen and the instruments. And my bunk is right here. But it was just delightful having a view as a navigator. So I did put a photo in there, here and there. Pre-race preparation at home. Basic items. Paper charts. You got to have the paper charts for the start, finish, the overall course. That's really important as a way of communicating to the crew, and other important corners. Generally, you end up with 6 or 8 paper charts. Highlight the paper charts with hazards. Write all over them. Write notes on the paper charts. Post them for the crew, and then own them. Meaning, for the navigator, you want to buy these charts yourself, and then so you can take them when you're done, and so you can keep them, because these notes, the notes on those charts is a great way of preserving your homework for subsequent races. Memorize the hazards. Where the rocks are in the vicinity of the corners and the start. And I say that, put that one in twice, because it's really important. Electronic charts, you update the latest. Polars for the boat, both the ORR polars and the designer versions. The nav polars, again, must be achievable on average, so they're not targets. You laminate the target table. I'll show you an example of what that is, but that's the table of boat speed and wind angle targets, upwind and down, that's posted on deck. And those tables, generally, you never edit that table without sort of a crew meeting with the trimmers and the helmsman. Those are just constant references, and if you change those tables, the crew loses sort of reference. So those often get computed once and they get posted, and you only change them due to a big meeting. And those ones are often aggressive. They're very, very different than your navigation polars. And you're the only one that uses the navigation polars. So when you find that the boat doesn't perform very well in certain conditions, you're not going to insult anybody by them looking at your polars, but nevertheless you need to accurately predict the performance of the boat. Laminate the sail chart, multiple copies. Laminate the sailing instructions, the notice of race, chart fragments that are particularly useful, that show hazards in the start area or the finish area. Have multiple copies of that. And then I find it useful to have a daily schedule that I laminate and post for my own purpose, so that when you wake up after a nap and you're groggy, you can just figure out what time it is, what am I supposed to be doing next. That would include the weather downloads, roll calls, watch changes, fleet analysis, all of that. Documentation for the electronics and instrumentation, you got to go through, find it all, put it on a memory stick. Often that memory stick will live with the boat, but few boats are organized ahead of time to have that stuff. But it's really helpful to have all that stuff ahead of time. Select your weather consultant, start the discussions with them, read accounts of previous races, but don't dwell on it. You're racing your own race. And the big change today with the really good weather data that we all have is that you don't have to navigate races like the Bermuda race by reading old yachting magazines and deciding it's a southwesterly, so you got to go here. You have to navigate your own race. But it's useful to read previous accounts. Talk to experienced navigators, ideally in person. Ask them what the key decisions are, when are the key decisions, and they will answer. And this is a convention of navigators, that everybody is really open. And then, of course, we have to be open to new budding navigators, and that's just part of the culture. So navigators will answer your questions, and so must you. This is a typical sail chart. This is the thing that you do edit this as you go on. And what I often do during a race, during a leg of a Volvo, is I'll edit this in Magic Marker, and I'll edit the ones that are on deck and the ones that are posted below. And then between legs, you update it and come up with a new printout. But this is just a simple lookup, true wind angle and true wind speed. You can see the sail. And then generally, you put other stuff on top, which could be the boat's boat speed, or it could be VMG. In this case, it's what the daggerboard configuration. And these are real helpful. I also have a program that I run all the time on a boat, which is I put up a graphic of the sail chart on a window of the computer, and then I have a program that automatically positions 3 symbols on top of this chart that move around. One symbol is where the boat is now, true wind angle, true wind speed. Another symbol is what the configuration would be if the boat were pointing directly at the next mark, and then the third symbol is where would the boat be if the boat were at the fastest CMG to the next mark. And then you have those three symbols moving around. And it's a little hard to understand now, but it's so useful that I always leave that running, because if it's not running, the guys on deck, when they nip down below to take a look at it, will wake me up to get it running. So I just always leave it on the desktop of the computer when I'm taking a nap. Because the guys on deck have their own sail chart, but they love having a sail chart that's automated where they see the three symbols. And typically, if the three symbols aren't pretty close cluster, or if you're not between the fastest CMG and the rum line to the mark, then you need to make sure you understand why not. This would be the table that gets posted on deck. These aren't your navigation tables. Again, these are your targets, but as a function of wind speed, you've got your boat speed upwind, your true wind angle upwind, your boat speed downwind, and your true wind angle downwind. Some small boats, people prefer apparent wind angles downwind, but it just depends on the nature of the sailors you're working with. And then typically, these are laminated and stuck with Velcro in the cockpit, and then you take them off when you're at the dock so your competitors don't see them. Navigator's kit. This includes stuff that should be on the boat, but this is nevertheless stuff that I bring if I'm navigating a boat sort of temporarily. And then if this boat has good stuff already, if it's a well-equipped boat, then you just leave your own kit in your with your shore clothes. But just to go through it quickly, light spectra cord. You always need this. It's handy to have your own handful of it. Self-adhesive Velcro so you can stick stuff around the nav station. USB memory sticks. Submersible headlamp, ideally with red. A mini digital voltmeter. Rigging tape. A multi-miniature screwdriver tool, the kind of thing you need to get little bits and pieces off the computer. A Leatherman or equivalent, small wire ties, magnifying glass, particularly important as I've gotten older. Ziploc bags, a handheld GPS, digital watch that keeps time, has stopwatch, hand bearing compass and spares. You need spare hand bearing compasses because the tactician and the strategist will forget theirs, ask to borrow from you, and then if it's a multi-race inshore race, unless you get them back, they'll take them off to the hotel and not bring them back the next day. So you go through dozens of hand-bearing compasses. So always bring spares. A small 7x30 daylight binoculars with a built-in compass. Steiner makes a fabulous set. Small VHF with speaker mic, particularly for me because I can't hear very well. Dividers, 2 triangles. Now, a well-equipped boat should have some of this stuff, but nevertheless, always bring it so you don't waste hours, shopping around for the stuff that's missing. If it's a transoceanic race, I'll always bring a sextant. They don't weigh anything. The plastic micrometer drum sextant weighs nothing, takes up some space, and then you tear out a little section of the nautical almanac, and you're protected. And the thing you're protecting against isn't a failure of the boat's GPS, because you have your handheld GPS. The thing you're protecting against is something going wrong with the GPS system, or more likely, the government shutting it off because of some terrorist problem. Very, very small chance that this would happen, but if you can't find the finish, you'll never live it down. So I generally bring, in a transoceanic race, I'll always bring a sextant. Roll of paper towels, you have to have your own. Backpacking towel. These are the synthetic towels that you can wring out. So, when you're going up and down off deck and you got to keep your hands dry, a synthetic backpacking towel that you can wring out is perfect. Sharpies, the Papermate yellow plastic twist pencils, laminated SIs and NORs, the CDs for software installation, a mirrored hard drive. What this is an important race. A week before the start or a few days before the start, you create a mirror of the hard drive on your principal navigation computer and then put it in a Ziploc bag. So if something goes wrong with the hard drive on the computer, you can put in the new hard drive and that computer will be back in the state it was when you created that mirror. I had the start of a leg on the Volvo race on ABN AMRO. I get down to the boat and the computer won't boot. and it was just frightening. But fortunately, I had a mirror, was able to put it in, and then a fully prepared computer, then worked again. So that's a great backup. A wet note notebook. Then you got to bring extras. You're sitting in the chart table, everybody wants to borrow stuff. So you got to have extra tape, extra Sharpies, extra pencils, extra wet notebooks, extra wire ties, and you need that inventory because people come and borrow it from you. The racing rules, the OSRs, protest forms, your own yellow and red flags in case the boat doesn't have them, a calculator, and for the same reason I bring a sextant, I bring a slide rule. Because if the boat does get a ton of water down below and nothing works, it's just a lot easier to dead reckon with a slide rule than doing the arithmetic by hand. That's another shot at the Groupama instruments. It's hard to see, but we're going 33.7 knots in, I think it's 25 knots of wind. But I think I tried 10 times to take a picture and could never get one that wasn't blurry. This is the barometer. This is a German barometer. We've got a wings and plow barometer that you can take a look at. It's a better choice because it has a larger graphic display. The week before the start, continued. Memorize the sailing instructions, the course, the starting order, the flags, the check-in ritual. Notes are fine. It's good to write this stuff down, to have a cheat sheet, but you've got to memorize it. Memorize the times for the weather downloads, memorize the hazards. Update all the computer. Typically, if you're preparing for a week before a race, the first thing I'll do is to update the computer and update the software. And so that if you've introduced a problem with these updates, you're going to have some time to deal with it. The bad time to do Windows updates or to update to the latest version of Expedition would be the day before the race or the morning of the race. So get that stuff done early. Check for your certificates, the boat's documents, run the virus scan on the computer. Make sure the virus scanner is installed. A number of boats on Volvos have had virus infections during the race over the satellite communications, and it's a huge mess. So you do want to have a virus scanner, up to date and running. Mirror the hard drive. Go through the chart table and navigation gear. This is important. So you bring a small bag, a small duffel bag, and you get all the crap out of the nav station. And these are other people's wallets, spare parts, winch pawls, old cell phones, all kinds of junk. And then put it in a small duffel bag. And then sailors will continue to stuff their cameras and iPods and wallets and stuff into the nav station. And I just routinely empty it all out and stick it in a small duffel bag and stash it somewhere so that the nav area can be a useful functional area. And then when the race is done, you can put all the crap back in the nav station. Assemble the Navigator's ditch bag. Typically I'll take one of these plastic bags that's a dry bag and has a zipper top and put in it the handheld GPS, a handheld VHF, a spare battery, and the dedicated antenna for the Iridium phone, the entire crew's passports, a flashlight, and then you write a search and rescue phone number on the back of the Iridium. And the reason you want all the passports, twofold. One is it's nice to have them all in one place, but another one is it's the only way to make sure that everybody has a passport. Because if somebody doesn't have a passport, then none of you can get off the boat, and that's a drag at the finish. So I always collect up the passports and put them in the ditch bag. That's the Groupama nav station. You can notice the particularly ergonomically designed back. But this was a particularly uncomfortable nav station to spend 48 days at. The two GPSs in the background, one of them is an iStar, and then one of them is a hemisphere, which is a combination GPS compass and, of course, GPS. Okay, further, the week before the start, calibrate the instruments. And when you calibrate instruments, the order of operations is critical. First, you get your knot meter calibrated. Then your apparent wind angle. And the apparent wind angle just so that you're tacking symmetric and the wind is reading the same angle in the two tacks. Apparent wind speed, most instruments you don't calibrate that, you go with the factory cal. Then you swing the electronic compass and test it. Only now, when you've calibrated that stuff, do you move on to doing your computed wind. So then you do your true wind corrections, upwind, reaching, and downwind, so that as you tack and as you jibe, the true wind direction stays constant. And ideally, you do this in a blustery northwest wind. You do it in a well-mixed wind. You're wasting your time to do this in a building thermal because of the twist of the wind with height. Once you've got your wind angle corrections done, then you do your true wind speed correction. So when the boat's doing windward marks and leeward marks, you make sure that the wind speed is reading the same upwind and down. You find you have to do multiple correction tables, and this is a disadvantage of our modern world. But you need different correction tables for tight luff versus flying luff A-sails. You need different correction tables for fractional versus masthead spinnakers. And so that means that whenever the boat sail configuration changes between those sails, you got to put in a new set of cal tables into your instruments. And instruments these days, they don't make that all that easy, but nevertheless, it's a necessary step. Then you've got to continue to repeat the true wind angle and the true wind speed calculations. And then don't panic when they're all completely out to lunch. When you happen to be sailing in a day where there's a lot of twist with the wind vertically, or there's a lot of wind shear, different wind speed with the wind vertically. And that happens particularly in a building thermal. Calibrate the barograph. Barographs are really helpful. The barograph, of course, is the barometer that not only reads the pressure but gives you a little graphic chart. Easiest to calibrate them with the nearby airfield over the internet, the METAR reports. Peter lent us a good unit that you can take a look at the end of the talk, but it's really helpful to have a barograph. My favorite unit historically has been the Vetus. They don't make them anymore, but Peter's unit is I think now the best choice.
Stan, for the multiple calibration tables for the Code Zero versus a normal A-sail, is that something that correlates to the true wind angle and the true wind speed that you? So is it automatic, or do you actually go and manually change those?
You got to flip it back and forth, and because there'll be a kind of a crossover range in the middle where you could have either sail on, and so in that case you have to switch. And what I do is I'll have one basic table, and then I'll edit it for the two sails, and then if you forget to change the table but nevertheless you're sailing on a part of the table where you're going upwind, well then it doesn't matter which spinnaker table you got. But nevertheless, if you're in a range where it could be either sail, you need to pick between the tables. And then what I try to do is to have a ritual on the boat for whenever you change sails. When the sails are changed, the boats that I've sailed on, the Navigator is always on standby. So whenever a sail gets changed, you're reefed or unreefed, I'm up on deck anyway. And so then what I'll do is I'll log the change and then make sure that I've got the right cal tables in. Please stop me to ask questions like that. You're not supposed to get this tired during the motion. This is a problem. You got to make sure to sleep before you're tired, otherwise you make mistakes when you look like that. More in the week before the start. Swing the conventional compass, and you got to know how to do this yourself, because the old World War II guys are getting old, and they're either getting spotty in their ability to do this, or you can't find them. So you got to know how to swing your compass. And this is the approach I use, and I won't go into too much detail because it could be its own talk. But unless it's a steel boat, remove the corrector magnets. If it's a normal, fiberglass, non-metal boat, the corrector magnets often do more, make things worse than they help. And even if you use the corrector magnets properly, the corrector magnets can induce errors with heel. So the first thing to do is to remove them entirely. Don't just set them to zero. Then use the distant landmark method. And the concept of the distant landmark method is if you have a boat and it's floating around and there's a distant landmark, if the compass is working perfectly, the bearing, sighting across the compass card, the bearing to that distant landmark should stay the same no matter how the boat is pointing. And if the bearing to that distant landmark changes, as a function of the heading of the boat, well, that's the deviation that you're trying to measure. So what you do is go out into deep water where there's not going to be a sunken barge that you don't know about. Pick as far away a landmark as you can distinctly see. Then keep the boat in one spot. Have a buoy nearby. Keep the boat in one spot so you know the bearing is going to stay the same, and it doesn't matter what the bearing is. And then slowly rotate the boat to the 8 cardinal and intercardinal headings and take bearings on that distant landmark. And do this on every sextant. And then plot the bearing to that landmark as a function of the heading of the boat. Then what you do is you take by eyeball, for those of you who are mathematicians or engineers, by eyeball you do the first 2 terms of the Fourier transform, which is that table, if you plot the heading as a function, if you plot the bearing of the distant landmark as a function of the boat's heading, for normal fiberglass, non-metal boats, there's going to be 1 sinusoid cycle. And that's due to the fact that you've got some steel on the boat. And in some cases, there'll be 2 sinusoid cycles, and that'll be due to the fact that there's flex focusing due to the metal of the boat, but that's much less common in sailboats. So you basically eyeball this table, force it in almost every case to be a single sinusoid. Now, there's one other compass correction term, which is the fact that the compass isn't installed in the boat straight. The best way to address that is to fix it. So what you do is you measure the distance between the compasses, go up forward, come back on the lifelines till the lifelines are the same distance apart, two bits of tape, sight the compasses, rotate them to line up perfectly. Now you don't have a steady rotation correction term. If you can't put the compasses in the boat properly, then what you have to do is you have to take this table that has a single sinusoid, and then you have to add to it a constant plus or minus offset term to accommodate for the fact that the compass is rotated in the boat. But that single sinusoid term doesn't have a constant term. So then you add it up and then you have a perfect compass deviation card. And this takes an hour or so to do it, and you need a couple people to help to move the boat around. But you get a perfect deviation table, but you have to do it yourself. Check that the basic electronics installations are complete. The VHF DSC has the MMSI number. The GPS interfaces work to all your instruments. The AIS is configured with the MMSI number. The EPIRB is registered properly. And the Navigator's got to do all this stuff. Still more in the week before the start. Make sure that your satellite communications accounts are working, your SailMail account, whatever. Make sure it's all interfaced and that you're able to download your data. Typically, the files you use most are the GFS for a global model and coamps for a mesoscale or a small model, because they're free to everybody and you never have a Rule 41 problem. If you're going to use other sources of data like predict wind or like the European model, they can be good data, but you've got a potential Rule 41 problem. So before you use those other models during a race, be absolutely sure from the notice of race and the SIs that it's legal. In addition to other preparation that you do prior to the race, and of course when you're preparing for a race, there's no restrictions on what data you can use. But in addition to that other preparation that you're doing before the race, go through the daily ritual that you'll do on board the boat, which is board the boat, you're almost always going to have a 6-hour cycle where you go through a series of steps every 6 hours as soon as you're able to download the weather models. And go through that ashore. So start several days before the race to run through your onboard ritual, running routes and downloading the data that you will download during the race, just to make sure that everything works. Now when you're ashore, you can also download higher resolution data and more sources, but be sure to do it on the boat so that you know that you can, that everything's working, including the satellite or the single sideband or whatever you're using for downloading data. A fleet analysis tool. What a fleet analysis tool is it's what you do with every roll call, or with periodic roll calls if there's continuous tracking. But there's good fleet analysis tools in Expedition. I've written my own. But basically what it's used for is it's used as a quick and easy way to plot where the competitors are and then to analyze the competitor's performance. So typically what I'll do in a fleet analysis tool is to take each boat's performance, modify it for our performance given the rating difference for the boats, and then you can very quickly analyze the fleet to see if other people have better wind conditions in some other part of the course. So I use an Excel spreadsheet to do it, but there are tools that are included in packages like Expedition. Periodic briefings in the week before the start with the weather expert and with the skipper and with the watch captains. This is interesting. You don't want to prejudge your plan and make a plan prior to the night before. Really important not to get your mind set with a pre-established concept of what you're going to do. But you do need to have a tentative plan the night before, but make clear to the skipper and the watch captains that it's tentative. And then you must have a plan the morning of the start. So the morning of the start, to keep your head clear and to be able to focus on the start and getting squared away, you have to have a plan and you have to have the courses memorized. So when the watch captain or a sailor asks this navigator, what's our initial courses, you can't be fumbling through your paperwork or looking at a chart. You have to have a plan, you have to know the numbers. If you're using a starting tool, sometimes it's not a good idea depending on how much the afterguard is sailed together, but if you are using a starting tool, you got to practice it with the helmsman, the tactician, and the bowman, and you got to work out the terminology that the helmsman and the tactician want. Whether your terminology is time to burn, whether your terminology is time to the line and time to the start. And then you've got to calibrate the turn rate of the boat and the time to speed of the boat. But typically I'll find for an offshore race with folks that aren't set up and used to using the starting tool, it's most clear to use terminology of, we've got 45 seconds to the start and we're 30 seconds from the line, rather than to say we got 15 seconds to burn. But whatever the terminology is, you just got to agree to it ahead of time. And then you have to be in cahoots with the bowman on when you're going to back off and when the bowman is going to make the final call. That needs to be coordinated so that the helmsman and the tactician aren't left in the lurch. But typically that's kind of obvious. It's at about the 10-second point. Then finally have a squall. If it's a race with an element in the tropics, you need a chalk talk with the crew about how to handle squalls, how to detect the different type of squalls, how to play the squalls. But it's really helpful if that can be done as a chalk talk. The bad time to do that is in the middle of the night at 3 in the morning with a squall bearing down on the boat and you're asking the crew to jibe off of a gorgeous header. And that's a bad time to be getting into an argument of why you've got to jibe off this fabulous header. That you want to have that chalk talk ahead of time so that everybody thinks about the two different kinds of squalls the same way. That's Groupama, that's Franck Hamas. To port, and this would be sort of a typical update session that takes place with the watch captain just before a watch captain goes on deck every watch. Week before the start, if you're the electronics guy on board, and most navigators end up being the electronics person, run the batteries and the charge system through a complete cycle. So, operate the boat as if you're in a race all the way down, charge it back up, make sure everything works. Understand the electrical system, draw an overall schematic. Some boats don't have one. Test all the electronics straight away when you get down to the boat so you have some time to fix it if it doesn't work. Test all the lights, running lights, compass lights. Best if that's done at night. Test the spare running lights, which you have to have for the OSRs. And check and inventory all of the spares. I'll go through a quick list of spares. So if you're the electronics person and you're going to be the one that is expected to fix stuff if it doesn't work electrically, you got to have the tools, crimps, spare wire, fuses, compass lights, running lights, a spare regulator, ideally identical to the regulator that's the primary one, soldering iron, tip with the soldering iron is never leave the soldering iron tip on the soldering iron. Take the soldering iron tip off and put a hot knife tip, because once the guys, the riggers, use your soldering iron to melt line, then it doesn't solder worth a damn. So always keep your soldering iron blade off the soldering iron. Solder complete spare masthead wand in addition to a spare electronics board for it, spare cup, spare vane. Spare PC power supply. This would be the inverter that goes from 12 or 24 to the PC voltage. As I mentioned, a hard drive for the PC that's mirrored. Spare boat speed paddles, WD-40, heat shrink, dielectric grease, wire ties, a crossover cable for Ethernet, an extra USB to serial adapter, so if things break you can still interface, serial extension cables, and then extra wire ties, tape, and heat shrink to allow for borrowing. That's the nav station on ABN AMRO 2. So this was their first trial boat. And this isn't the boat that I actually sailed around the world, but this is the first boat that we first kitted out. You can see the two computers. What I'll typically do is I'll set up both computers so that I can live with either one. So both computers are set up to run all my stuff. Then once they're all set up, I'll typically dedicate the computer on my left, which is where I can hear, as the communications computer. And that's where the skipper would often spend a lot of time, doing email and other things. But I've certainly set it up to where both computers, either one, can do everything. Morning of the start, have a plan. Make sure you have memorized the headings, the tack and jibe headings. Bad time if, just before the start, if somebody asks you, what's our original heading or when should we tack, that's a bad time to have to go look at the chart. You want to have that number on the top of your head. The all-crew briefing, you have to do this, but don't do it till the boat leaves the dock. So what you want to do is, sort out the schedule with the skipper ahead of time, get the boat off the dock early. So then you have time to sort of motor around in the vicinity of the start, and during that time, that's a great time to do the crew briefing because folks are focused. When the boat's still on the dock, they get family and girlfriends, and it's just a very difficult time to get attention. So for the all-crew briefing, that's the time when you have the entire course chart. You walk through the overall course, the overall weather, the initial plan, hazards in the vicinity of the start, penalty ritual, special rules, the start ritual, check-in, restrictions, life jackets, flags, all those requirements. Because if any mistakes get made on any of that stuff, it's the navigator's fault. I always, to keep myself from getting too jittery and too nervous, I'll always have a checklist in my pocket the morning of the start so that I don't have to rack my brain for what I'm forgetting. I've just got a list, I can go through it. And that would be, that I've got my chart dongle and memory sticks and handheld radio with a speaker mic and personal gear, but just have that checklist ahead of time for the morning of the start. Sync your watch to start time. Most race officers, as you all know, synchronize their start to GPS. So it's just a nice fallback to have your watch pre-synchronized, because then makes it much easier to get the warning and the prep. Sync the bowman's watch, so you seek out the bowman and get his watch squared away. Final weather check, and then once again, stay off the bricks and don't hit the marks. So the ritual offshore, this is the periodic ritual, and this is something that, again, I find it's a good idea to have a laminated schedule where you can refer to it as a function of time and refresh yourself on what it is you're supposed to be doing. But the ritual is, first of all, stay off the bricks and don't miss the marks, meaning whenever you wake up, you want to check that. And I keep saying that, but it's remarkably important. And you'll hear stories, even from Volvo navigators, where they get their head into the tactics and strategy and they overlook the fact that, the Pedro and Miguel rocks or whatever they are actually pretty much ahead of the boat. So you gotta always be keeping that in mind, that you want to get the fundamental stuff right. And then the sequence is, this would be for your 4-hour or your 6-hour cycle. You download the weather models and the weather maps. First thing you do before you do any routing is inspect them and do an eyeball route, meaning look through the weather map and just sort of do an eyeball of, make your own decision on what you think you should do. Then inspect the models in a grid viewer and do eyeball routing from that. Run initial routes. What I'll typically do right about then is I'll compute the forward and the reverse isochrons, and it's a really easy way of identifying the don't care areas in the race course. The areas of the race course where you have a lot of flexibility in course without spending any distance. And this is something that the normal router doesn't make clear. A normal route, you run a route and it shows a route. And some navigators think, well, the computer has all these cycles and all these great programs, that must be the right route. But there are regions in that route that are unimportant, where there's a wide variety of space you could go to without losing any distance. And you have to identify those areas, and you have to understand why that's the case. And there are ways to identify them, using Deckman or Tactique or Expedition. And you need to make sure you know how to use those tools. But basically what you do is you compute the forward and the reverse isochron and look for the areas where those isochrons are running parallel. You want to formulate the key questions. What's important? What goes wrong if the weather is wrong in different ways? Faster, slower, more turbulent, lighter at the fronts if you get stuck at a front. Tinker with the routing, asking questions, put in more wind, start later, start sooner, slow down, stop at certain points. But you want to tinker with it, and you want to end up understanding what's important. And then you've got to understand why the route is the way it is. And you have to understand it so that you can explain it to a skilled sailor using a sailing description. Okay, here's the deal. There's more wind over here, so we got to go here. Then we got to get to this front, and then we're going to tack in the header, and we're going to go over there. And if the route is telling you to do something, and you can't explain it to a skilled sailor in sailor speak, then you don't understand it. And don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that the router is doing something cosmic that you can't understand in sailing speak. It's not. If you tinker with it enough, you'll be able to understand it in sailing speak, and as soon as you do understand it, then you'll think of some questions, like, well, my God, what happens if that front comes late and then we're hung out to dry? Or what happened, you'll think it through and you'll be able to do a much smarter job. But the key to it, and this is the most important part of the daily cycle, is to tinker with the routing until you can explain it to a sailor, with hand sailing. Develop risk assessments and the cost of insurance. And what that means is, a risk assessment is, what goes wrong if something happens? What goes wrong if the weather's faster, slower? What goes wrong if a competitor hits this other corner? And the cost of insurance, and I always tend to think about it in terms of costs, but how much do we have to pay to cover this competitor? Or how much do we have to pay in distance? How much is it going to cost us if we position our boat in such a way that we don't care whether that cold front comes later or comes sooner? So just always be thinking about it in terms of how much you're going to pay in terms of distance. And then there's other times where you have to pay in terms of distance in order to position the boat for something you need to do later. Run the routes for your competitors. Some cases you use your own polars, but you put yourself in their water because you want to understand the routing differences. In some cases, you run their polars in their water so you can see what they're looking at. Brief the skipper. Do a detailed, and this is where I write the log, but do a detailed written log entry summarizing the weather, strategy, and tactics. And this is a really helpful document to have later, and it's even a helpful thing to do at the time because it forces you to sort out your thinking. Plot the track and the competitors on the paper overall course chart. Print out the weather map, the weather map for that 6-hour period and a 12-hour forecast, and post it along with notes. Post it typically in the galley or over the stove. Meet with the watch captains, brief the watch. So you end up briefing the watch every 4 hours or every 6 hours with a detailed 12-hour forecast of what to expect, a sailor's description of the plan, the competitors' locations and their tactics, what to watch for, and then you got to take a nap and get something to eat and then do the whole thing again in the next 4 or 6 hours. And then I found in terms of dealing with skippers, this isn't always true, but it's certainly true of Mike Sanderson and Frank Camas, is when I do the briefing for the skipper, I've got to make just a little bit of small talk to figure out whether they're in a bad mood. And if they're in a bad mood, you never lead with your suggestion, because often the skipper will then start to argue against it. So you figure out whether they're in a bad mood. If they're in a good mood, you can save time, you lead with your suggestion and then say why. If they're in a bad mood, you never say what your suggestion is, you just present information. And then you just keep presenting information until they come to the same conclusion that you have. But it's really important, I found, to figure out how to work with the skipper. Navigation career tips. Keep your day job. And I get asked a lot of times by especially young upcoming navigators, how do you become a professional navigator? And keeping your day job, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that professional sailing is a rotten way to make a living, unless you're, Caird or Kostecki or something. So it's good to have a real job. The other reason is that if you have a normal career, you don't have to fall into the pitfall that some professional sailors fall into, which is if they need the money, they can't say no to a job. So then they end up getting offers from undesirable programs and they have to take those jobs. And then in sailing, as in a lot of other parts of life, once you've made a commitment, you have to keep it. Whereas if you have a normal job, what you can do is you can be a lot pickier. And then when a last-minute opportunity comes along, whereas a navigator on a Grand Prix fabulous boat gets ill, and you get a last-minute opportunity to parachute in, you can take it. So it's really good to not have to take every job opportunity you have, but to have the ability to have a normal life and a normal career, and then pick the opportunities as they come along as you get offered. So this is a really nice option if you have it. And for me, it's worked fabulously to have a normal career and then to be able to sort of switch back and forth. Crush them with preparation. That's the way you do well as a navigator. You've got to be rock solid in the basics. Don't go aground, don't miss the marks. We all do it, but try to do it less than the next guy. Check as many boxes as you can. This is particularly important for a Volvo project or something if you want to get into that. But every major program, they need at least 2 people that can check every particular box. They need 2 electrical people, 2 diesel mechanics, 2 hydraulics people, 2 winch mechanics, 2 medical people, 2 boat builders, riggers, sailmakers, provisioning, media. So if you want to get a job as a navigator, you want to be able to check as many of those boxes as you can. And don't assume when you're working as a navigator that the right answer is complicated or subtle. I've navigated against a lot of folks who are really, really smart. And they sometimes make the mistake if they figure out some 3rd or 4th order effect. And they're so proud of the fact that they figured out this 4th order effect of what's going on in the atmosphere that they think that it's going to matter. And generally it doesn't. Often the right answer is the simple answer. Hey, there's more wind over there. Or it's the fewest miles. So even though you're really smart and you can figure out the complicated stuff, don't assume that the answer is complicated. Finally, this was my father's advice for all offshore sailors, and I found it to be very good. Keep your head warm, your feet dry, your eyes open, and your mouth shut. That's all I've got. Any questions?